Steve Harvey had seen almost everything in his years of hosting Family Feud. The laughter, the tears, the outrageous answers that made him throw his question cards. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that autumn afternoon when 93-year-old Evelyn Hart stepped forward during Fast Money. No one expected the elegant retired piano teacher to share a story that would leave the entire studio frozen in disbelief. When Evelyn revealed what her husband Richard had done just days before he passed away, even the unflappable Steve Harvey couldn't maintain his composure. The moment that followed would become one of the most profound in television history, proving that some truths are too powerful for even the brightest studio lights. Evelyn Hart was 93 years old. For nearly 65 years, she had built a life with her husband Richard in their cozy home in Portland, Oregon. Her delicate hands, now marked with age spots and adorned with the simple gold band Richard had placed there in 1960, had taught piano to over 3,000 students throughout her career. Those same hands had held Richard's through 65 years of life together, the joy of watching their 3 daughters grow up, and the quiet everyday moments that make a marriage rich. The Hart family had come on Family Feud as part of a special episode celebrating multi-generational families, with Evelyn joining her daughter Susan, Susan's husband Mark, and their 2 adult daughters, Lily and Grace. Evelyn hadn't planned to participate actively. She was just happy to be surrounded by family and fulfill what had been Richard's lifelong dream to attend a television show taping. But when Mark developed severe allergies minutes before filming and couldn't stop sneezing, Evelyn had quietly volunteered to take his place. "I might be old, but I still have my wits about me," she had told her worried daughter. "Your father would have wanted me to help." What the audience didn't know, what even her family didn't fully understand, was that Evelyn was carrying something far heavier than her years. Just 5 months earlier, Richard had passed away at 91, ending their 65-year marriage. What Evelyn hadn't shared with anyone was what happened in their final week together and the promise she had made beside his hospital bed. A promise she was now unexpectedly in a position to fulfill on national television. As Evelyn stood at the Fast Money podium, Steve noticed something unusual. Most contestants fidgeted nervously or bounced with excitement, but Evelyn stood perfectly still, one hand resting on what appeared to be an old folded envelope in her cardigan pocket. Her eyes held not the confusion or disorientation that sometimes came with advanced age, but rather an intense clarity of purpose that made Steve pause. "You ready for this, Mrs. Hart?" Steve asked, his voice instinctively softening with respect. Evelyn nodded, her voice steady despite her years. "I've been ready for this my whole life, son. More than you know." The Hart family had already won the main game, with Evelyn surprising everyone by providing 3 of the winning answers despite her age. Now it was time for Fast Money, and Susan had gone first, scoring an impressive 162 points. Evelyn needed just 38 points to win the $20,000 prize for her family. 20 seconds on the clock. Steve announced as Evelyn took her position. "Name something people do to relax after a long day." "Take a bath," Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Name a place where you might see a grand piano." "Concert hall." "Name something you might find in a jewelry box." "Earrings." "Name a reason someone might stay up past midnight." "Reading a good book." "Name a famous composer." "Mozart," Evelyn said as the buzzer sounded. The audience applauded politely, but there was tension in the air. Evelyn had seemed distracted during the last 2 questions, her eyes drifting toward the envelope in her pocket. As Steve prepared to reveal the scores, Evelyn suddenly raised her hand. "Mr. Harvey," Evelyn said, her voice suddenly stronger, "before you show those answers, I need to say something." Steve looked momentarily confused, but nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Take your time." Evelyn pulled the envelope from her pocket, her hands trembling more noticeably now. "My Richard, my husband of 65 years, he passed away 5 months ago." A sympathetic murmur swept through the audience. "In our last week together, he made me promise something." Evelyn carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a piece of paper. "You see, Richard and I watched Family Feud every single night. For years, he'd say, 'Evelyn, one day we should go on that show together.' I always told him we were too busy. that we'd do it someday when we retired. Then when we did retire, I said we were too old, that it wasn't for people like us." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "5 days before he passed, he asked for a pen and paper. He was so weak, but he insisted on writing something down." She held up the paper, now visible as a list of 5 items in shaky handwriting. He said, "Evelyn, I've figured out the answers to fast money. If you ever get on that show, these will win it for us. This is our dance, Evelyn. One last dance." The studio had fallen completely silent. Steve stood motionless, his usual animation replaced by rapt attention. "I laughed and told him he was being silly," Evelyn continued. "But he made me promise. He made me swear that somehow, someday, I'd try these answers on the show. I never thought it would happen. But when my granddaughter Grace got us on the show, and then Mark got sick, I knew Richard was giving me one last chance to keep my promise." Evelyn looked down at the paper in her hands, now trembling visibly. "The truth is, Mr. Harvey, I didn't use Richard's answers just now. I was too afraid of letting him down, of looking foolish if they were wrong. I used my own answers instead." She looked directly at Steve, her eyes now filled with tears. "I failed him, Mr. Harvey. In our final moments together, he asked just one thing of me, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't trust him enough to keep my promise. After 65 years of marriage, I still doubted him." The studio was absolutely silent. Steve Harvey stood frozen, the scoring cards forgotten in his hands. After nearly 20 seconds of complete stillness, an eternity in television time, Steve slowly walked over to Evelyn. "Ma'am," Steve said quietly, "may I see that list?" Evelyn handed over Richard's letter with trembling hands. Steve studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he set the fast money scoring cards face down on his podium, removed his earpiece, and walked off stage. The audience gasped. The producers began frantically speaking into their headsets. Evelyn stood alone at the podium, confusion and distress evident on her delicate face. For nearly 2 full minutes, an unprecedented break in filming, the stage remained empty except for the 93-year-old woman standing uncertainly with her husband's last wish clutched in her hand. Then Steve returned, but not alone. Behind him walked the show's executive producer, 2 production assistants, and a legal representative, all looking solemn. Steve approached Evelyn and gently took both of her hands in his own. "Steve," said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio, "in all my years hosting this show, I've never done what I'm about to do." He turned to address the audience and cameras directly. "Family Feud has strict rules. Contestants must give their own answers. We protect the integrity of the game. That's how it works." He paused, looking back at Evelyn. "But some things are more important than rules." Steve turned to the executive producer, who nodded solemnly. "We're going to do something unprecedented," Steve announced. "With permission from our producers and standards department, we're going to honor Mr. Hart's last wish." Steve carefully took Richard's list and walked back to his position. "Mrs. Hart, we're going to replay your round of fast money. But this time, I want you to give me exactly what Richard wrote on this paper, in the order he wrote it. Can you do that?" Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can do that? But the rules?" Steve shook his head. "Some promises transcend our rules, ma'am. This is one of them." The audience burst into applause that lasted nearly a full minute. Evelyn's family rushed from the sidelines to embrace her, all of them crying. Steve had to wipe his own eyes. When the studio finally quieted, Steve took his position again. "All right, Mrs. Hart, 20 seconds on the clock. Are you ready to dance one more time with Richard?" Evelyn nodded, clutching the paper in both hands. "Ready." "Name something people do to relax after a long day." Evelyn looked at the paper. "Listen to music." "Name a place where you might see a grand piano." "A home." Evelyn read, her voice growing stronger. Name something you might find in a jewelry box. A wedding ring. Name a reason someone might stay up past midnight, talking with someone you love. Name a famous composer. Evelyn's voice broke as she read the final answer. Chopin. The buzzer sounded. The audience was already on their feet. Steve walked to the board, but before he could reveal anything, he turned back to Evelyn. Mrs. Hart, before we show these answers, can you tell us why Richard chose these specific answers? Evelyn wiped her tears with a tissue her daughter had handed her. Richard and I met at a Chopin concert in 1959. He wasn't musical at all, but his roommate dragged him there. I was performing that night. After the concert, he came up to me and said I made the piano sing. She smiled through her tears. Our first date, we stayed up until 3 a.m. just talking. He proposed to me in my parents' living room, right next to their grand piano. He didn't have much money, so he gave me his grandmother's wedding ring from the jewelry box his mother had given him. Steve's eyes were glistening. And the music? Every night, even after 65 years, I would play piano for him. Just 10 or 15 minutes. It was how we unwound, how we reconnected after our days. It was our ritual. It was us. Steve took a deep breath and turned to the board. All right, let's see what we got. Name something people do to relax after a long day. You said, listen to music. Survey says, the number 4 answer flipped. Listen to music. 18. The audience erupted. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands. Name a place where you might see a grand piano. You said a home. Steve paused for effect. Survey says, the number 2 answer appeared. Home. 27. Susan grabbed her mother's shoulders from behind, both women crying openly. Name something you might find in a jewelry box. You said a wedding ring. Steve was struggling to maintain his composure. Survey says, the number 1 answer flipped. Wedding ring. 39. The studio was in chaos. Everyone was on their feet, crying and cheering simultaneously. Steve had to take a moment, turning away from the camera to compose himself. Name a reason someone might stay up past midnight. You said talking with someone you love. Steve's voice cracked. Survey says, the number 3 answer appeared. Talking on phone / with someone. 21. Evelyn's legs seemed to give out, and her daughters caught her, holding her up between them. The family was clinging to each other, overwhelmed. Steve walked closer to Evelyn, his own cheeks wet with tears. Mrs. Hart, we have one more. Name a famous composer. Richard said Chopin. He turned to face the board. Survey says, the number 1 answer flipped. Mozart. 41. There was a moment of confused silence. Chopin wasn't on the board. But then Steve's face broke into the widest smile. But Mrs. Hart, let me tell you something. You already had 117 points. You needed 38. You won the $20,000 for your family. The studio erupted again, but Evelyn was shaking her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. But Richard got one wrong. He got one wrong. Steve gently took her hands again. Mrs. Hart, you got 5 answers. Richard got you 4 that were on the board. 4 out of 5 in fast money is extraordinary. But more than that, he got you something more valuable than points. He got you answers that told your love story. And that's worth more than any game. The family surrounded Evelyn, everyone holding each other. Grace and Lily were sobbing. Susan kept saying, Dad knew, he knew. Steve gave them several minutes, making no move to hurry them or return to the game format. When they finally separated, Steve addressed Evelyn again. Mrs. Hart, can I ask you something? Why Chopin? Why do you think Richard put Chopin when Mozart was the more obvious answer? Evelyn smiled through her tears, and for a moment, she looked decades younger. Because Richard never cared about the obvious answer, Mr. Harvey. He cared about the right answer for us. Chopin was our composer. Mozart belongs to the world, but Chopin was ours. That night we met, I played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. I played it at our wedding. I played it when each of our daughters was born. I played it the night before he." Her voice caught. "The last piece I ever played for him was Chopin." Steve nodded slowly. "So Richard wasn't trying to win the game. He was trying to remind you of your love story." "He was trying to dance with me one more time," Evelyn whispered. "Our last dance." Steve turned back to Evelyn and her family, who were still embracing each other on stage. He walked over slowly, giving them time to compose themselves. When he reached them, he spoke softly. "Mrs. Hart, I need to tell you something. In all my years doing this show, I've seen people win money. I've seen families celebrate. But what you just did, what Richard did for you, that's not about winning a game. That's about love. That's about a man who spent his last days making sure his wife knew one more time how much their story mattered." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. Her daughter Susan had her arm around her mother's shoulders, tears streaming down both their faces. Steve continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You said Richard wanted one last dance. Well, ma'am, he got it, and we all just got to witness it." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Steve didn't try to stop it. He just stood there, with the Hart family, letting the moment be what it was. Some of the audience members weren't just clapping, they were openly weeping, moved by the raw emotion of what they'd just witnessed. Even the camera operators, usually invisible behind their equipment, were wiping their eyes. When the applause finally died down, Steve made a decision. He turned to his producers in the booth and made a cutting motion with his hand.
"We're going to take a break from the regular show format,"
he announced to everyone. "I don't care about the schedule. I don't care about keeping on time. This moment right here, this is what matters." He turned to the opposing family, the Thompsons, who had been watching from their side of the stage. "Y'all okay with that? We're going to take some time here." Michael Thompson, the family patriarch, stepped forward. "Mr. Harvey, we're more than okay with it. My wife and I have been married 32 years, and what we just saw, that's what we hope we have in another 33 years. Take all the time you need." The Thompson family nodded in agreement, several of them visibly emotional themselves. Steve acknowledged them with a nod of respect and gratitude, then walked over to Evelyn and sat down on the Family Feud steps next to her, something he rarely did during tapings. The formality of the show had been completely abandoned. "Tell me about Richard," Steve said gently. "I want to know about the man who could figure out how to say, 'I love you,' even after he was gone. I need to understand this love." Evelyn took a shaky breath and smiled, her eyes getting a faraway look. Richard wasn't a romantic man in the traditional sense. He didn't write poetry or buy flowers every week. Some of my friends would complain about their husbands forgetting anniversaries or birthdays, but that wasn't Richard's problem. His problem was that he paid too much attention. She paused, and a small laugh escaped through her tears. "He noticed everything. Every little thing that mattered to me, even things I didn't know, mattered to me." Steve leaned in, genuinely interested. "What do you mean?" "Well," Evelyn said, gathering her thoughts, "when we were first married, money was incredibly tight. This was 1960. Understand? Richard was working as a mechanic, and I was teaching piano lessons out of our tiny apartment. We could barely afford groceries, let alone luxuries. We couldn't afford to go out to dinner, couldn't afford to see movies, couldn't afford much of anything, really." Susan interjected softly. "Mom never told us it was that hard. We didn't want you girls to know," Evelyn said. "But it was difficult. Some nights, we'd eat toast for dinner, because that's all we had. But every single night, no matter how tired he was, no matter how many hours he'd worked, Richard would come home, wash the grease off his hands, and he would sit in that old armchair we got from the thrift store. It was threadbare, and one of the arms was broken, but it was ours." She smiled at the memory. "And he would sit there, and he would listen to me play piano for an hour, sometimes more. He said it washed away the day, that it made everything worth it. Steve noticed Grace, one of the granddaughters, nodding. Grandpa still did that, Grace said. Even when I was little, I remember going to their house and Grandma would play piano and Grandpa would sit in his chair. Same chair for 65 years. Just listening. He'd request the same piece every time? Steve asked gently, though he suspected he knew the answer. Evelyn nodded. Chopin's Nocturne, in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. He said it reminded him of the night we met, of how he felt sitting in that concert hall watching me play, knowing somehow, in a way he couldn't explain, that his life had just changed forever. Tell me about that night, Steve said. The night you met. Me? Evelyn's eyes lit up despite her tears. It was October 19th, 1959. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week after my 21st birthday. I was playing in a concert at the Portland Community Music Center. It was a small venue, maybe 200 seats, and it wasn't even full. But I was so nervous. It was my first real public performance. Not just recitals for students and parents, but a real concert. She paused, lost in the memory. I played 3 pieces that night, but the last one was the Chopin Nocturne. I remember looking out at the audience during the applause, and there was this young man in the 4th row. He wasn't clapping like everyone else. He was just sitting there, staring at me with his mouth open. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. That was Richard? Steve asked. That was Richard. After the concert, there was a small reception. I was standing by the refreshment table, trying not to look as nervous as I felt, when this young man walked up to me. His hands were shaking so badly, he spilled punch on his shirt. Evelyn laughed softly. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not good at this. I'm Richard. I don't know anything about piano or classical music. My roommate dragged me here because he had an extra ticket and I had nothing better to do. But when you played that last piece, something happened to me. You made that piano sing. You made it tell a story. And I think I need to know you. Susan was crying harder now. Dad never told us he said that. Your father was shy about the romantic things, Evelyn said. But he felt them deeply. So we talked for 3 hours that night. The venue's staff had to ask us to leave so they could close up. We stood outside on the sidewalk for another 2 hours, just talking. He told me about growing up on a farm in Idaho, about coming to Portland to learn a trade, about his dreams of someday owning his own garage. I told him about my parents immigrating from England, about how music was the language we spoke when English was too hard, about my dream of teaching. Steve was completely absorbed in the story. What happened after that night? Our first real date was 3 days later. He took me to a diner because it was all he could afford. We ordered coffee and split a piece of pie. We were there from 7 in the evening until 2:30 in the morning, when they finally had to close. The owner felt so bad about kicking us out that he didn't even charge us for the pie. Evelyn smiled. We stayed up until 3 in the morning just talking. He walked me home, and on my doorstep he said, I'm going to marry you someday, Evelyn. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I'm going to marry you. Grace gasped. Grandpa said that on the first date? He did, and I laughed and told him he was crazy. But 6 months later, he proposed. He saved every penny he could from his mechanic job. He worked overtime, he did side jobs on weekends, he barely slept. And on April 15th, 1960, he brought me to my parents' living room where they kept their old upright piano. Evelyn's voice grew softer. He got down on one knee right there next to that piano, and he pulled out this little velvet box. He said, Evelyn, I don't have much. This ring belonged to my grandmother. It's all I have to give you. But I promise you this, every day, for the rest of my life, I will listen to you. Really, listen. The way I listened that first night at the concert. I will hear not just your words, but your music. Not just your voice, but your heart. Will you marry me? Steve had to wipe his eyes. What did you say? I said yes, before he even finished asking, Evelyn said, smiling through her tears. We got married 2 months later, June 18th, 1960. We had $37 between us after paying for the license. My mother made my dress. Richard borrowed his roommate's suit. We had the ceremony in a small church with 20 people there. But it was perfect. It was us. And the ring? Steve asked, noticing the gold band on Evelyn's finger. Evelyn held up her hand, showing the simple ring. I've never taken it off. Not once in 65 years. Richard's grandmother wore it for 58 years. I've worn it for 65. It's seen more love than most rings ever will. Lily, the other granddaughter, spoke up. Grandma, you never told us any of this. We knew you and Grandpa loved each other, but we didn't know the story. Your grandfather was a private man, Evelyn said. He didn't like making a fuss. He believed that love was something you did, not something you talked about, but he lived it every single day. Steve leaned back, taking it all in. Mrs. Hart, you said Richard gave you those answers, called it your last dance. Why those specific answers? Walk me through them. Evelyn pulled out Richard's list again, her hands steadier now. Each answer is part of our story. When he wrote, listen to music for how people relax after a long day, that was us. That was our ritual for 65 years. No matter what happened during the day, no matter if we'd argued or if everything was perfect, every evening I would play piano and he would listen. It was how we reconnected, how we found our way back to each other. And a home for where you'd see a grand piano? Steve prompted. We never had a grand piano, Evelyn said. We always had that same little upright from my parents' house. But Richard used to say that any house where there was music and love was a grand home. So the piano wasn't grand, but the home was. That was Richard, always seeing the bigger picture. Susan wiped her eyes. I remember Dad saying that. Whenever we'd complain about our house being small or not having things other kids had, Dad would say, this is a grand home, because you're in it. Evelyn nodded. That was him, finding the grandness in the ordinary. What about the wedding ring? Steve asked. That one breaks my heart, Evelyn said softly. Richard put wedding ring because he wanted me to remember that moment in my parents' living room. That moment when he promised to listen to me, to really hear me for the rest of his life. And he kept that promise, Mr. Harvey. For 65 years, he kept that promise. Even when he got sick, even when he could barely speak, he would still sit in that chair and listen to me play. He would close his eyes, and sometimes he'd move his fingers like he was conducting, and I knew he was still hearing every note. The studio was completely silent, except for the sound of people quietly crying. Steve waited, letting Evelyn take her time. The fourth answer, talking with someone you love for why you'd stay up past midnight. That was our first date. That was us at that diner, talking until they closed. That was us on my doorstep, talking until the sun came up. Richard said that was the moment he knew, not when he saw me play piano, not when I smiled at him, but when we'd been talking for hours, and he realized he wanted to keep talking forever. Grace spoke up again. Grandpa used to say that to me. He'd say, Gracie, when you meet the right person, you'll know because you'll never run out of things to say. He told all of you that, Evelyn said, looking at her daughters and granddaughters. Because it was true. Richard and I never ran out of things to say. Even after 65 years, we'd sit at breakfast and talk about the newspaper, or the birds in the yard, or nothing at all, really. But we were talking. We were connecting. That's what he wanted you all to know. Love isn't just the grand gestures. It's the daily conversation, the staying up late, the choosing to engage with someone even when you're tired. Steve nodded slowly. And Chopin. Why Chopin? When Mozart was the more obvious answer. Evelyn smiled through her tears, and for a moment she looked decades younger, like the 21-year-old girl at her first concert. Because Richard never cared about the obvious answer, Mr. Harvey. He cared about the right answer for us. Mozart belongs to the world. Everyone knows Mozart, but Chopin was ours. That night we met, I played Chopin's Nocturne. I played it at our wedding. I played it when each of our daughters was born. I played it on our 25th anniversary, our 50th anniversary. I played it the night before he." Her voice caught. "The last piece I ever played for him was Chopin." Steve had to take a moment, visibly struggling with his emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "So Richard wasn't trying to win the game. He was trying to remind you of your love story. He was trying to dance with me one more time," Evelyn whispered. "Our last dance. Because Mr. Harvey, when Richard got sick, when he knew he was running out of time, he told me something. He said, 'Evelyn, I've loved you in 1,000 ways, but my favorite way was always the quiet way, the listening, the sitting together. That's our dance. Not in a ballroom with music and lights, but in our living room with you at the piano and me in my chair. That's our dance.'" The emotion in the studio was overwhelming. Steve stood up and helped Evelyn to her feet. "Mrs. Hart, do you still have that piano? The one from your parents' house?" Evelyn nodded. "It's the same one we moved into our first apartment. We couldn't afford a professional mover, so Richard and 3 of his friends carried it up 4 flights of stairs. We've moved 6 times over the years, and every single time, Richard insisted on moving that piano first. He'd say, 'The house isn't home until the piano is in place.' When we finally bought our own house 30 years ago, the piano was the first thing through the door." "And you haven't played it since he passed?" Steve asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. "I couldn't. I'd walk past it every day and I'd see his chair, empty. The house felt so silent. For 65 years there was music, and then suddenly, there wasn't. I couldn't bear to play, knowing he wouldn't be there to listen." Steve looked at the producers in the booth, then back at Evelyn. His voice was firm but gentle. "When you get home tonight, I want you to play that Chopin piece. I want you to sit at that piano and play it, and know that Richard's listening. Because love like that doesn't end, Mrs. Hart. It just changes form. He's still listening. He's always listening." The studio erupted in applause again, but Steve held up his hand. "I'm not done. Mrs. Hart, you know what you did today? You kept your promise. Richard gave you those answers because he wanted you to have one more moment with him, one more dance. And you did. You stood at that podium and you read his words. And for those 20 seconds, it was just you and him again. That's what he wanted. That's what he gave you." Evelyn was crying too hard to speak. So she just nodded. Her whole family had gathered around her again, all of them holding each other. Steve let them have the moment, then gently guided them back to center stage. "Let's get you and your family that check," Steve said. $20,000. Because of Richard's answers. Because of your love story. Because 65 years of marriage taught a man exactly what his wife needed to hear. As Steve presented the oversized check to the Hart family, the studio was still buzzing with emotion. He looked into the camera, his expression serious. "You know, we do a lot of episodes of this show. We give away a lot of money. We have a lot of laughs. And that's good. That's what we're here for. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds us why we're really here. It's not about the game. It's not about the prize money. It's about the families. It's about the love. It's about moments like this that show us what really matters." He turned back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Hart, thank you for sharing Richard with us today. Thank you for keeping your promise, even when you were scared. Thank you for showing all of us, everyone in this studio and everyone who's going to watch this at home, what 65 years of love looks like. Because that's rare, ma'am. That's special. That's something worth celebrating." Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Thank you for letting me dance with him one more time, Mr. Harvey. Thank you for giving me that gift." Steve's voice was thick with emotion. "No, ma'am. Thank you for giving us that gift. Because everyone who witnessed this today, we're all better for it. We all understand love a little bit better. We all know what it means to really listen to someone, to really see them. Richard taught us that today, through you. The episode ended not with the usual fanfare and outro music, but with a quiet shot of Evelyn holding Richard's list, her family surrounding her, all of them holding each other as the audience continued to applaud. Some people in the audience were standing, some were sitting, but all of them were moved. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was witnessing something sacred.